You may have seen the series of shorts we put together going over the symbols in the book of Revelation. But for this video, let's focus on the big picture and bring it all together. Now, many think this book is about the future, but hopefully you'll see how precisely this book predicts the first Jewish-Roman war at the end of Jesus' generation. So we'll talk about that today on Extraordinary Evidence. The book starts with letters to 7 churches outside Judea. And we've been asked, if the book is prophesying the desolation of Jerusalem and Judea, why is it addressed to churches so far away? How could they be affected? Would they even care? We have to remember this judgment was coming on descendants of Israelites who were implicated in murdering the prophets and righteous within Israel throughout the centuries. This was a Mosaic law judgment, as we'll see clearly in a second. But those marked for judgment didn't have to be in Judea. Most were because they had traveled there and gathered for Passover, which was a requirement of the law. As they arrived to Jerusalem, the doors of the city gates were shut on them, and the most intense period of the tribulation started. So we see verses like Revelation 18:2. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become a habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. The city itself had become a cage they couldn't escape from. As far as those outside the city, they could actually be affected. The army wasn't the only arm of God's judgment. They could be affected by famines, pestilences, local uprisings. Look at what Jesus told the church at Thyatira. But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her sexual immorality. Behold, I will throw her onto a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her I will throw into great tribulation, unless they repent of her works. Sexual immorality here does not have to mean literal sexual immorality. In context, he's likely speaking of idolatry, which is the other sin outside of killing the prophets and righteous that the nation of Judah was being judged for. And it's also why the city is depicted as a harlot in chapter 17. Look at what was predicted when the Mosaic law was established. Deuteronomy 31:16, the Lord said to Moses, Behold, you are about to lie down with your fathers, and this people will arise and play the harlot with the strange gods of the land, into the midst of which they are going, and will forsake me and break my covenant, which I have made with them. Play the harlot. They were being implicated in idolatry and bloodshed, and Josephus, a first century historian who was directly involved in the events, confirms these judgments did spill outside Judea. Look at Wars of the Jews, Book 7. Yet did this war afford disturbances and dangerous disorders, even in places very far remote from Judea. So while we might see ourselves in some of the attitudes and actions of the churches, the text is not about us. These were specific warnings of the actual coming judgment these people could be swept into. The book then moves from those 7 churches, and we're presented with a scroll that has 7 seals. We find out that Jesus, the Lamb who was slain, is the only one who was worthy to open the scroll where the judgments were written. The slain lamb is Passover imagery. Like the blood of the lamb who protected Israel from the death angel in Egypt, the blood of Christ, their Passover lamb, would allow the judgment to pass over them if they accepted the sacrifice. Isaiah had also prophesied of this day. Come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until the fury has passed. For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. And the earth will disclose the blood shed on it, and will no more cover its slain. Enter your chambers and hide yourselves for a little while. This was Passover imagery. And the Lamb whose blood was covering for the elect was about to unseal the scroll of judgment on the objects of wrath. In Daniel, a precursor to Revelation, also prophesying these same events, he was actually told to seal up what he had seen until the time of the end of the age, not the end of the world. From the time of Daniel, it had been sealed. Now, at the end of Jesus' generation, Jesus was unsealing it. The first 6 seals represent events in that 40-year generation leading up to the war. These seals correspond to the birth pains Jesus laid out when talking to his disciples on the Mount of Olives about the events that will lead up to the tribulation. Remember, Jesus said, Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So when the Lamb opened the first seal, a white horse, whose rider had a bow, and he came out conquering and to conquer. This rider on a white horse with a bow can be contrasted with Jesus, who was also a rider on a white horse, but he had a sword coming from his mouth. This is a false Christ, And it corresponds to Christ's words in Matthew 24:5. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And we know from history there were many false Christs in this time. Take, for instance, Menachem, who put on royal garments and walked into the temple as though he were a king. Or Jonathan, who led many into the desert, promising that he would show them signs and apparitions. When the second seal was opened, a rider on a red horse, who was permitted to take peace from the earth. Jesus said, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. And during this period, there were many wars. Rome had campaigns against Britain. There were Parthian wars. There was a Roman civil war. There was a revolt in Gaul. Even though they were living during the Pax Romana, Jesus told them that they would begin to hear of rumors of war. When the Lamb opened the third seal, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. This horse represents time of famine, and Jesus had already told his disciples there would be famines during this period. Look at the book of Acts. And one of them named Agabus stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine all over the world. So there have been famines throughout history, but this was specific to the period in that generation leading up to the judgment. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, we see the pale horse, who was given authority to kill with sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beast. Now, Jesus doesn't mention these in the birth pains, but these are specific curses of the Mosaic law. Look at Deuteronomy 32, and I will heap disasters upon them. They will be wasted with hunger and devoured by plague and poisonous pestilence, the teeth of beasts, and outside the sword will bereave. These 4 specific judgments were also mentioned prior to the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon. They were Mosaic law curses, and we see them happen in history. Book 5 says they were puffed up by the famine and swelled like men in dropsy. A great number of the captives were destroyed, some being thrown to wild beasts. So before we go forward, let's make sure we see what's happening here. This is specific Old Testament Mosaic law curses playing out in history. So the Mosaic law isn't just words on a page. This was an actual covenant between Israel and God. Israel broke the covenant, and now these curses were coming upon them. When the Lamb opened the 5th seal, under the altar were seen the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God. Jesus had told his disciples, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And throughout Paul's letters and the book of Acts, the texts that were written during this 40-year period, we see them speaking of these persecutions. 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 4 says, in all your persecutions and in the afflictions that you are enduring. God's messengers were undergoing persecution and tribulation, but God was about to repay with tribulation those who had been causing his messengers tribulation. When the Lamb opened the 6th seal, there was a great earthquake, which also lines up with Jesus' words, that there would be earthquakes in various places. And Josephus also talks about this, and amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth. That was an earthquake. These things were a manifest indication of some destruction that was coming upon men. Now, the seals don't mention false prophets, but in the birth pains, Christ does mention false prophets that will lead many astray. And Josephus was a witness to this as well. These were such as deceived and deluded the people under pretense of divine inspiration. A false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction. Now there was then a great number of false prophets. So we have a witness of all these things in the 1st century. We're not looking for these things today. They all happened in the 1st century. The 7th seal is the war itself. Inside the 7th seal are 7 trumpets. Inside the 7th trumpet are 7 bowls of wrath. The image shows the intensity of the judgments rising. Inside the 6th seal, just prior to the 7th seal, we have a reference to the sun going dark. This signals the start of the war. It's the same period Jesus was prophesying in Matthew 24. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. This is the dark day of the intense judgment of war. The language of the sun going dark is repeated in the 4th trumpet. The first image of the sun going dark signals the first 3.5 years of the war. The second image of the sun going dark prior to those final 3 woes was prophesying the second half of the war, the most intense period for Jerusalem, which would be kicked off by a 5-month siege of the Roman army. These were the locusts who appeared when the 5th angel blew his trumpet. Prophesying that 5-month siege, he said they were allowed to torment for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And Revelation says during this 5-month siege, people will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. And Josephus, who also witnesses, says those who were thus distressed by the famine were very desirous to die, and those already dead were esteemed happy, because they had not lived long enough either to hear or to see such miseries. Check out what happens when the Lamb opens the seventh seal. It says there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Check out what Josephus says about that same time period, just before the war. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were coming great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month of Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar in the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. Now, as Josephus mentions here, the war was preceded by a rebellion of the Jews against Rome. A series of events led to the Roman procurator Florus accusing the Jews of back taxes and taking money from the temple. The Jews mocked Florus, and Florus came in with great force against the Jews. This caused the Jews to rebel against him. And this rebellion is actually what kicked off the war. So let's link this to the New Testament. A verse that many think is talking about a future Antichrist, but it's actually talking about this period. And it's an amazing prophecy in the New Testament that we look right over. The letter to the Thessalonians was probably written in the early 50s AD. Paul is actually prophesying, telling them something that was about to happen a little over a decade later. And we miss it because we put the verses in the future thinking it's about a future Antichrist. But listen to what he says. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day, the day of the Lord, the day of judgment on Judea, this day right here, will not come unless the rebellion comes first. This is the rebellion that he's talking about. This rebellion of the Jews against Rome. And the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Now the rebellion got so bad that the high priest Ananias was killed. This is the same Ananias in Acts chapter 23, who ordered Paul to be struck on the face, and Paul said that God was going to strike him. Another New Testament prophecy that was fulfilled. And as this rebellion raged on, Nero sent a man named Cestius Gallus to come down and put down this rebellion in Judea. He came down from Syria, marched all the way to Jerusalem. As Jerusalem was in disarray, he could have taken the city, but he turned around and left. This afforded many people the opportunity to leave the city. I'm sure many of those have recalled Jesus' words. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. So after Cestius leaves, the Jews follow in pursuit and actually score a victory on Cestius and the Roman army. This gives them much unwarranted confidence. Nero then sends a more experienced general, Vespasian, and Vespasian then starts his campaign throughout Galilee and Judea. When he takes this city called Giscala, a man named John flees from Giscala and goes to Jerusalem. John and two other factions war over the city, dividing the city in three parts. Revelation 16:19, the great city was split in three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. The city being split into three parts were these rival factions partitioning the city. Look at what Josephus says. It so happened that the sedition in Jerusalem was revived and parted into three factions, and that one faction fought against the other, which I esteem the beginning of the city's destruction. The cities of the nations falling is speaking of these cities of the Galilee, Galilee of the Gentiles. These cities began to fall. This John of Giscala had taken control of the temple. His men were killing the worshipers in the temple. Blood was flowing in the temple. Bodies were building up in the temple. They were using the temple implements for their own uses. He was moving about in restricted spaces, going into holy places, displaying himself as being God. So we see Paul's words come to life. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day, the day of the Lord, will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. They were worried that the day of the Lord had already come, but Paul was telling them of events that had to happen first. These were those events. So while Vespasian is going through Galilee and Judea, another revolt breaks out in Gaul. And we then see the fulfillment of Daniel 11:44 and 45. It says, but news from the east, Judea, and the north, Gaul, will alarm him. And he will go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. Those two revolts, along with many other things in Nero's reign, caused the Senate to lose faith in him. They named Galba as emperor. Nero then commits suicide, being left out to dry by the Senate. Look at what Daniel then says. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge over your people, and there will be a time of tribulation, such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Those who were covered by the blood of the slain Lamb Jesus would be delivered from this judgment. But Daniel is prophesying this same tribulation under Nero and then Vespasian. So Galba becomes the emperor for a short time. Otho then becomes the emperor, and then a man named Vitellius becomes the emperor. All in succession either killed or committed suicide. This is Daniel 7 coming to life. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them. He shall be different from the previous ones, and he shall put down 3 kings. And he shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. And he shall think to change times and law, and they will be given into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. That's 3.5 years. Vespasian becomes emperor. That's reigning over the last half of the Jewish-Roman War, the most intense period. But we have something interesting happen. Before Vespasian claimed the throne, before he went back and defeated Vitellius, he was actually about to take Jerusalem. He only stopped because he heard the news of the upheaval in the leadership in Rome, and he saw his opportunity to claim the throne. He had encompassed the city again, and he left. This afforded the people another opportunity to leave the city. But after he claimed the throne, he gave Titus control of the army in Judea, and Titus encompassed the city one last time, Passover, 70 AD. This time he wouldn't leave. This time marked the 5-month siege of the Locusts. So if we're looking at our timeline of Revelation, the third woe, the bowls of judgment. These bowls are reminiscent of the plagues of Egypt. The sea and the rivers turned to blood. One thing to consider is there were sea battles in this war. So devastating were these wars, and so overwhelming that blood was flowing in the water. These were actual things that happened. The sun was allowed to scorch men. When the Romans were taking Samaria, the Samaritans gathered on a high mountain, and many died of heat exposure, also showing that these were things that were actually happening. These judgments were actually happening during this period. And then we come to the portion where it says, and great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, the size of a talent, fell from heaven on people, and they cursed God for the plague of hail because the plague was so severe. This plague of hail at the end of these 5 months, where the Romans had been surrounding the city to starve out the inhabitants, the stones of the Roman catapults being shot into the city. Many of these stones are being unearthed today, and we can actually see these quote-unquote hailstones that were being thrown into the city. And when those walls fell, the Romans went in and took the city. And when those walls fell, we understand the voice that came from the throne when the 7th angel poured out that bowl, saying, "It is done. The city, Mystery Babylon, have fallen." Jesus had warned Jerusalem about the coming judgment for persecuting the prophets. They said if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. Jesus says, so you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I tell you, all these things will come upon this generation. So if we wipe out all the symbols of Revelation and just focus on the warnings given to that city, look at how the words echo. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. For they have shed the blood of the prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. It is what they deserve. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs, or the witnesses of Jesus. A witness in the New Testament is something very specific. It was one who had been with the apostles, with the disciples, from the baptism of Jesus all the way up to his resurrection. So when it said he's drunk with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus, there are no witnesses of Jesus alive today. These were judgments on Jerusalem. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you, the apostles and prophets, against her. For his judgments are true and just, for he has judged the great prostitute who corrupted the earth with her immorality and has avenged on her the blood of his servants. In the Mosaic law, rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down with him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land. This was a specific Mosaic law vengeance on Jerusalem and Judea. So what do skeptics think? Look at what Bart Ehrman, a skeptic and leading New Testament scholar, believes the texts are about. From a recent podcast promoting his book Armageddon, he says the writer of Revelation's views were that the Romans have all this power and wealth, and the Christians should have those things. They're the good people, and he's going to take it from the Romans and give it to the Christians. So the Christians will be powerful, and they'll be massively rich. And the way that's going to happen is God's going to destroy the other guys. So he sees the book of Revelation as the destruction of Rome and a wealth transfer between Rome and Christians. It's not at all what the book is talking about. Those warnings were specific warnings against Jerusalem for killing the prophets and the righteous. So look at what Elaine Pagels thinks the book is about. Speaking of a Roman temple, she says, you could go around this temple in honor of the Roman emperors and their gods, and you could see 30 nations that they had conquered and subdued and pictured as female slaves that were being dominated by Rome. And one of them was Judea, the land of Israel. So other people might be very impressed with the Roman emperors and their gods, but someone like John would be very angry. Where was God? How could he allow that to happen again to the holy city? She sees the book of Revelation trying to give an answer to this question. How could God let that happen again to the holy city? But it's just the opposite. John already knows why this is happening to the holy city. This was John's warning to the holy city prior to that destruction. This was a judgment that had been decreed hundreds of years before. And Revelation was one of the final warnings. Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. So hopefully this overview kind of helps to bring things together and show how the book of Revelation lines up perfectly with the fall of Jerusalem. Any questions that you might have, we'll try to answer those in the comments. So for a more immersive look at these same events, check out this video. Peace and have fun exploring all the extraordinary evidence. We believe there's a mountain of evidence, so let's start at the base and climb all the way to the top.